All right, there. Welcome back. This is going to be part two of Arendt's on totalitarianism. And so we're going to talk about at least the first half of sort of chapter 11a, totalitarian propaganda, right? And we've got a lot here. So I think we'll cover this one in two, and maybe the next one in one, or probably another two. Okay. So, as discussed in a former section in the lecture, mob and elite sort of get caught up inevitably, at least according to the argument of Arendt, that the mob uh, and the elites get caught up inevitably in totalitarianism, but this sort of nebulous middle class has to be either propagandized or terrorized, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that. Um, the first reason is that in the beginning, at least, the masses can still act for themselves, right? And often they can act democratically, right? If you think about, Hitler's regime, and so they have to be won over before sort of true totalitarianism can begin. And then there's terrorism, and Aaron's claim is sort of they're separated, right? Propaganda comes first, terrorism comes second. Once propaganda has worked, quote, indoctrination comes next, often with violence, to, quote, realize constantly its ideological doctrines and its practical lies, right? And Arendt also suggests that the propaganda is largely aimed at external audiences, not internal audiences. And there's a couple of reasons for this, and also sort of sympathizers of the enemy, right? But also sympathizers potentially within their own ranks. People who are sort of in the middle, don't know who to pick, that sort of thing. Um, and he says there's also going to be sort of powerful internal bureaucrats. Um, yeah, okay. So, yeah, it's aimed at bureaucrats, it's aimed at the citizens who haven't made up their mind yet. But mostly it's aimed at potential enemies or neighbors, anyone who thinks there's a strategic advantage to question you, right? And so he says there's basically two influences on how much propaganda is needed. The first is the size of the internal movement, and the second is the amount of external pressure, right? So the more of these there are, either the size of the internal movement um, can make propaganda just much easier to push out, but also the amount of external pressure coming in and trying to get in. So consider North Korea contemporaneously, where we're constantly from different places pushing in propaganda to the North Korean people to get them to sort of fight against their government, right? And so propaganda sort of becomes unnecessary when complete totalitarian kicks in, right? It's not used in concentration camps. It wasn't used in sort of in gulags for a whole lot of things. And so it kind of disappears. And at that point, it just becomes total violence when people realize what's going on. And Arendt says propaganda, in other words, is one and possibly the most important instrument of totalitarianism for dealing with the non totalitarian world. Terror, on the contrary, is the very essence of its form of government. Okay, Arendt also makes a couple of points that we should talk about totalitarianism and propaganda. The first is that the Nazis got much of their ideas about propaganda and about violence from the American system, which was kind of scary to read. But she says they basically got it from studying gangster organizations, mostly mob organizations in the United States, especially during the Prohibition era, um, and then also from U.S. advertising, and they talked specifically about soap, but cigarette advertising was very famous at the time, that sort of thing. Um, oh, excuse me, my neck is killing me. So Aaron says this does not mean that Nazism was gangsterism, as has sometimes been concluded, but only that the Nazis, without admitting it, learned as much from American gangster as their propaganda admittedly learned from American business publicity. So really interesting argument. Um, Arendt also says there's almost always in the beginning these sort of ambiguous hints at further violence, and says more specific in totalitarian propaganda, however, than direct threats and crimes against individuals is the use of indirect, veiled, and menacing hints against all who will not heed its teachings, and later mass murder perpetrated on, quote, guilty and innocent alike. Arendt also suggests that propaganda is sort of difficult to use against actual party members, right? You have to be completely disjointed from the reality of politics and economics to really be fooled by the propaganda, right? Arendt goes on and says that leaders like literally cannot admit that they are wrong under totalitarianism and under a lot of dictatorial regimes. And she says the chief qualification here, especially that sort of actually differentiates totalitarianism from some dictatorialism, is that the leader takes complete responsibility for everything, right? They are infallible. They cannot admit error. They take responsibility for all the sort of crimes committed under their names. So yeah, uh, Arendt says the chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. He can never admit error. And I put a little note, like think of cult leaders like Jim Jones, right? Where literally everyone had to die because Jim Jones screwed up and killed a United States representative from California. Um, and that sort of just absolute craziness. Who were those people who were the Halley's Comet people? I don't know. Y'all are probably too young for that, but like in the early 2000s, these like 100 people all committed mass suicide, thinking that Halley's Comet was God's spaceship or something, and some weird stuff. So that kind of stuff. But you would also point out people like Stalin and Mao and Hitler and Mussolini, right? Just think they're completely infallible. Um, Again, and Arendt makes this point over and over and over. Ambiguity or vagueness, right? Make vague promises to the masses. Quote, thereby promise a victory which is independent of, quote, temporary defeats, right? This larger victory, we're going to win this thing, right? Which is independent of temporary defeats and failures in specific enterprises. For masses, in contrast to classes, want victory and success as such in their most abstract form. So they're not looking for actual policy wins and stuff like that. Like they want this ambiguous, like social win the world kind of thing. Arendt goes on to say, totalitarian leaders discuss sort of the unmentionable in society, and this is really important for them. And this is one thing that I would sort of point out to a lot of the sort of Western demagogues that we're seeing, like Viktor Orban, the guy from Hungary, Marine Le Pen from France. God, who's the guy from Brazil? Every president ever from Brazil, basically. But um, anyway, the last president before Lula de la Silva. It kind of sounds like Trump, I have to be honest. The people who just keep bringing up these subjects that are not really socially acceptable, right? And the quote here is that, quote, like the earlier mob leaders, the spokesmen for totalitarian movements possessed an unerring instinct for anything that ordinary party propaganda or public opinion did not care or dare to touch. Everything hidden, everything passed over in silence became of major significance, regardless of its own intrinsic importance. The mob really believed that truth was whatever respectable society had hypocritically passed over or covered up with corruption. And so, Arendt basically says, like, this is the story of where anti-Semitism came into in Nazi Germany and even, Stalinist Russia, or Leninist Russia at least. was this need by the public to have some enemy who's conspiratorial and blah blah blah. So not blah blah blah. It's very important, but you should read the rest. We're just trying to hit the highlights. Um, uh, and so they go on, or Arendt goes on to say the masses generate this sort of giant false reality, right? And this sounds kind of familiar, especially with the advent of social media, right? So if we're talking about Narendra Modi's India, again, the guy from Brazil, I wish I could remember his name. Um, Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, others like this. They build this sense of false reality, right? Where statistics and these sort of things mean nothing to them. Quote, the effectiveness of this kind of propaganda demonstrates one of the chief characteristics of modern masses. They do not believe in anything visible in the reality of their own experience. They do not trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations, which may be caught by anything that is at once universal and consistent in itself. What convinces masses are not facts and not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably part. Repetition, somewhat overrated in importance because of the common belief in the mass's inferior capacity to grasp and remember, is important only because it conveys them of consistency in time. The revolt of the masses against realism, quote unquote, common sense, and quote unquote, the plausibilities of the world, was the result of their atomization, of their loss of social status, along with which they lost the whole sector of communal relationships in whose framework common sense makes sense. So this is not only Burke, but this is also sort of Fanon saying that like you're destroying our inner social being through colonialism. This is Karl Marx saying you're destroying our inner social being through industrialization. And so this is also contemporarily Englehart's argument of the sort of postmodern man, right? That we have this sort of postmodern ennui that is setting in deeply in at least contemporary literature. So yeah, it's a really interesting argument that popped out at me. Um, Arendt goes on and says, before they seize power and establish a world according to their doctrines, totalitarian movements conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself, in which, through sheer imagination, uprooted masses can feel at home and are spared the never-ending shocks which real life and real experiences deal to human beings in their expectations. So she's going to sort of neurobiology here and neuroscience and even psychology. The idea that these things offer up this vague, not only reward for membership, but also this vague idea of stability. Like we're going to roll back the clock to this time when you remember things were best and things were most stable. Um, and we're trying to make things as literally predictable as possible because the human brain absolutely despises new experience, is what we're finding as neuropathologists and stuff. So, yeah, interesting stuff. We got just a tiny bit more and then I'll shut this one down. Arendt also she tries to sort of disband the argument of apologists um, of the German people, basically, right? Apologists for the Nazis, apologists for the German people not being perfectly aware of what was going on, these sorts of things, and so Arendt gives sort of this history of what happened to the masses and said that this is sort of what kicked things off, right? And so Arendt says anti-Semitism has been woven into Europe long before the rise of Hitler, right? So this stuff comes from like even the Catholic Church from way, way, way back, saying Jews killed Christ and all of this stuff. And at the time, anti-Semitism was, the Jewish population was pretty decently integrated into society in Austria and Hungary, and so it was really sort of taboo. Like, come on, man, we don't talk about anti-Semitism and these sorts of things. Um, you know, and she says, so that was part of what led to this. And there were also, like in the newspapers and in tabloids and things like that, there were these sort of horribly anti-Jewish cartoons and propaganda pointing everywhere, that was really dehumanizing even prior to the rise of Hitler, right? And so the totalitarians come in with this sort of toolbox of these emotional, vague arguments with a clear enemy, the outsider, the symbolism that just completely surrounded the Nazi and the communist regimes of Mao and Stalin, right? The sickle and hammer, the swastika, the brown shirts, all of these sorts of things. So the mass symbolism. They also made sure that there were mass gatherings, right? Like outside participatory gatherings, rain or snow, you will be there. And because they know that mob mentality is promoted under these conditions, right? And we know that today that the more people in the room, the more mob mentality kicks in, right? It's kind of inherent in the words. Um, and then finally, never mention a particular type of government, right? Keep things ambiguous. Hitler tried so hard to never say democracy, communism, dictatorship, whatever. It was like this just, national socialism, this mix of the nationalism of the right and the socialism of the left, and let's just smash them all together so it sounds good, so we get Nazism. And the final quote I'll leave you with here for this lecture is: the fundamental reason for the superiority of totalitarian propaganda over the propaganda of other parties and movements is that its content, for the members of the movement at any rate, is no longer an objective issue about which people may have opinions, but has become as real and untouchable an element in their lives as the rules of arithmetic. The organization of the entire texture of life according to an ideology can be fully carried out only under a totalitarian regime. And so this is, a warning about, like, don't let politics creep into every single bit of your life, um, as a citizen, because that becomes very concerning, and you're sort of supporting totalitarianism if you do that. Okay, chapter, always be skeptical, questioning, right? Chapter 11b will be the next and final lecture of the semester. So thank you so much for being here. Have a great day. Goodbye.